Hi folks, welcome to your second lecture video for AP Government. And today we are talking about types, or you'll see it phrased as models of representative democracy. So make sure that you are on your notes that correspond with this video, and let's get started. So objective-wise, by the end of this video, College Board requires you to be able to, one, define or identify and define the three types or models of representative democracy. So representative democracy can take three big forms. What are those? And then number two, explain how these types or models of representative democracy are visible in major institutions or branches of government, policies, events, debates. Okay, so more real world application for number two. So let's jump into the video. And in the last lecture, we talked about the types of government, the purpose of government, how power is distributed. And we laid the foundation that America is a representative democracy. We elect representatives to represent the will of the people. They're the ones that make the laws, and we can vote them out if they don't. So we have this type of democracy, or a republic. And as our framers were thinking about how do we set up this government, a couple of these questions popped up. So who holds the power in democracy, or who should? Does everyone, or should everyone, have an equal say? So hopefully, as you're thinking of these questions in your own brain, right, who holds the power in a democracy? Hopefully you're thinking the people. Does everyone have an equal voice or say? No, they don't. And our framers debated these questions. Who should have the ear of the government, meaning who should have the most say? And should there be broad participation among the population, or should participation be filtered to a select group of people? And this is where we see a lot of the debate come from when we're ratifying the Constitution, and even today in the debates among policies between political scientists. So our very first type of representative or model of representative democracy is participatory democracy, rule by the many, or broad participation. So if you're thinking of the filter, participatory democracy has no filter. Okay, pretty much the premise or premise of participatory democracy depends on the direct participation of many or most in a society. And this is not just government, this is also public life as well. So everybody in society should be directly participating. People in participatory democracy vote directly for laws and other matters. So it's not filtered by a representative. And because of that, this is probably the closest thing to a pure democracy or a direct democracy, as was in Athens in the 5th century, like all the way back in ancient times. Now, the theory behind participatory democracy, which quite a few of our founders, particularly the anti-federalists, argued for, was that individual participation is going to lead to the wishes of the majority, right? If you have everybody participating, well, the majority, or what the majority want, is probably going to be the end result. And leaders in this type or model would be constrained to follow those wishes, because if they don't, they can be voted out of office. So, you want to have as much participation as possible to make sure that the will of the people is represented in the majority and that the leaders are following those wishes. Now, example-wise, right, this idea that there should be broad participation in politics, one of the examples that we see very, very frequently would be something like a town hall meeting. And these town hall meetings really are ways for local, even national leaders, politicians, to meet with their constituents, the people that they represent, to hear from them and their opinions on topics that they're interested in, to discuss upcoming legislation, to get their understanding of their positions on particular issues. Other examples that we see would be the recall. So this would be an election to unelect a government official, right? If the people are not happy with how the representative is doing their job, they can vote to recall them. If any of you are Parks and Rec people, you will know that in that show, the main character, Leslie Knope, is elected to city council, and then she is recalled because this town is not happy with the way that she is, or the policies that she is making. Another example of participatory democracy is a referendum. And a referendum is a piece of legislation that is put on the ballot for voters to approve or potentially vote down. These would be things like a school levy or a new tax, for example. And then an initiative or a proposition is basically the same thing as a referendum, but the issue is placed on the ballot by the people, not by the government, through a petition process. So the people are the ones that are actually deciding what measures are put on a ballot. So if you ever get approached by someone, one of the most common ones that I usually get approached is the legalization of marijuana. I've when I was living in Clifton, people would approach me quite frequently asking me to sign petitions for various measures, even because they need a certain number of signatures to put those on the ballot. So that is an initiative. Now, an example of a recall, you can see this was back in 2003, but you can see here what this would look like on a ballot. So shall Gray Davis be recalled or removed from the office of governor, yes or no? And then you would select the candidate to succeed or replace them if they are recalled. So you can see one of the big ones here was Arnold Schwarzenegger, the famous actor from Terminator, if you are familiar. So you can see that that is an example of a recall election. Here is an example of a referendum. So this here is basically an issue or a tax levy or a tax increase for a local school district. This particular one won 64 to 36%, and it's voting to increase the amount of taxes for this particular school district in Wisconsin. Oak Hills has had particular or specific referendums in the past as well. And then we also have an example of an initiative or proposition that was put on the ballot by the people. This was Prop, or as they're often known, Prop 64. And this basically was saying legalizing marijuana under state law for the use of adults like 21 or older. And as you can see, this one won. So this is an example of one of those initiatives or propositions. So our question then that arises is, can there be too much participatory democracy? Do we want broad participation on all issues, right? Like, for example, should the US go to war with Russia? Right? Do we want the broad participation of politics or people with all questions? So there are some pros and cons that go with this. And first, think about it like this. Participatory democracy is the closest to the original spirit of democracy, right? What democracy originally was in Athens, where you have all citizens who were eligible to vote voting directly on initiatives. Participatory democracy can also be seen in terms of benefiting the people because it's representing the people well, because it's direct or very, very broad. You have most of society putting their opinions and ideas out there, so representing the exact will of the majority. Now, cons, we kind of talked about this a little bit in the last video, but there are some difficulties to this. The size of our country makes it very difficult logistically to do this. Right, our country's very large, so this is difficult to conduct effectively and quickly. And can you trust people, the large portion of the population, to be informed enough to make choices beyond like local issues. So if you just type in a search for like Jay Leno goes like asking questions on citizenship, right? A lot of people do not inform themselves on the topics that are on ballots. And that is seen as a potential con, right? You might have people making these important decisions that are not well informed on the issues. The second model of representative democracy is pluralist democracy. So if any of you have ever read or seen the Divergent series, you can kind of think of that, right? There are different groups within a society, and that is really the hallmark of pluralist democracy here. So in pluralist democracy, the premise is that these non-governmental groups are going to organize based on their interest to influence decisions. And these have a couple different names. You'll hear them tossed around as factions, especially when you read Federalist 10, or interest groups. And we'll talk about interest groups later this year. Now, when it comes to how filtered participation is in this model, right? Broad participation in participatory, no filter. This one is slightly more filtered. There is a filter on participation in this because it's groups impacting decisions, not just the individual, okay? Examples of this, biggest one would be those interest groups. A hot topic obviously would be gun rights versus gun control. So non-governmental groups like Everytown for Gun Safety versus the National Rifle Association or the NRA. Both of these organize around their interests. So Everytown for Gun Safety would be for gun control versus the NRA, which would be for gun rights. So these groups have an interest in promoting their interest in government, right? The idea behind this is that our democracy is characterized by many, plural, that's where the name comes from, of these groups. And these groups compete, right? They have different and competing interests. And really, government officials take these competing interests and they listen to them. And basically, policy is made when officials search for a consensus between those competing interests. So these competing groups, for example, Everytown for Gun Safety and the National Rifle Association, they're obviously competing in the sense that one wants gun control versus gun advocacy or gun rights. And both of them are going to push and try to influence government officials to push their particular policies. How do they do this? Well, both of them are going to raise and spend money in elections to ensure that the candidates that favor their particular policies are the ones that get elected. They'll send experts to testify at congressional committee hearings, to educate members of Congress, for example, on their particular interests and their particular policy goals. They will monitor the actions of the government. They'll buy advertisements that you will see on TV to influence public opinion and get members to join and back them. So as you have all of these competing interests, the officials take those in and they establish policy based on those. So that is the idea behind pluralist democracy. Now, we do see an argument for pluralist democracy or theory in one of our founding documents, which is Federalist 10. And in Federalist 10, Madison argues that one person's voice really can only be so loud, right? Yes, you could have participatory democracy, but only one vote by one person is only so impactful. Now imagine this. Can you hear us now when we're as a group advocating for our particular policy issues? So you become, according to Madison, much more impactful when your viewpoints are grouped together and you're working toward a policy issue as a group. In Federalist 10, Madison is really going to say that our viewpoints are individually too scattered and disjointed, right? Single input can be diluted, right? The argument is that our voices or interests are stronger together, as I just mentioned. And this is a criticism that he has of participatory democracy. You are stronger as a group. And you do see this tension when we look at our founding documents between our founding fathers. And he's going to say in his document, Federalist 10, that a large republic, a large government with many interests or factions or these interest groups really is going to prevent one from dominating all of the conversation. And having many interests is going to prevent what is called tyranny of the majority in our political system. Okay. Now, benefits of this, really, when you think about it, good ideas surface when you have many groups competing to make policy and influence the government. You have a ton of different ideas being thrown around. So there are a lot of different ideas to solve the various issues that arise. No one group dominates the political discussion in theory, right? Because you have all of these different groups, they're all competing. So you have many different avenues of interests. And then finally, this theory is what makes compromise possible, right? Politicians, as we said, are trying to find a consensus or a middle ground between the competing interests of the groups. Now, not everybody always has agreed with Madison, particularly the anti-federalists. And we see a critique of pluralism in another founding document, Brutus I, which we will read later in this unit. So when we look at the writings in Brutus I and the anti-federalist argument, there's going to be a critique of pluralism. So let's take a look at some of these sections here. And I want us to think about how these sections argue that pluralism is bad or negative. Okay, so he says that the territory of the United States is of vast extent. It's very large. It now contains near 3 million souls, and is capable of containing much more than 10 times that number, which we know that it does. Is it practicable for a country so large and so numerous as they will soon become to elect representation that will speak their sentiments without becoming so numerous as to be incapable of transacting public business? It is certainly not. So what he is saying here is, look, country is already super large. It's only going to get bigger. Is it realistic to have so many interests at one time that they can all be basically heard in society? And he says, no, it's not logical. It's not theoretical. It's not it just can't happen. The country itself is just too large. He then goes on to say that in a republic, a representative democracy, the manners, sentiments, and interests of the people should be similar. So instead of having many groups, he says we should instead have similar interests. If this is not the case, there will be a constant clashing of opinions, and the representatives of one part will be continually striving against those of another. So he says here, when you don't have similar interests and you have many competing interests or factions, you have just constant conflict, and you can't have a functioning government. It slows it down too much. It prevents things from going in the will of the majority or for the public good. Okay, so he definitely has a critique of pluralism. And Brutus I, in this particular example, is actually having a huge impact on the way that we see pluralist democracy today. So I want to present to you an example of a critique of pluralist democracy. And let's say that we have our two interest groups. And this kind of gets into what Brutus was saying in his document. We have the Everytown for Gun Safety, okay, and we have the NRA, both of which are revolving around the use of the Second Amendment and guns, okay. Everytown for Gun Safety's policy might be to ban AR-15s. The NRA, on the other hand, is saying protect the Second Amendment, okay. Now, both of these groups are going to have citizens join and donate money to those interest groups. Okay? Their numbers, their membership, and the money that they have flowing into them will magnify the individual voices. This money, as I said, is going to be used to buy ads to influence public opinion. They're going to support candidates who will then push for their policies in government. Okay. Now, the problem becomes when you have especially money influencing officials and things like that. One of the critiques is that these groups can actually become more powerful than the government itself, which becomes a puppet just for these groups. And that's what Brutus was getting at here. So, when you think about it, both of these groups arguing for some sort of gun-related issue. When you ask the majority of Americans say that something should be done when it comes to mass shootings and gun safety. However, nothing seems to ever happen, right? That's the critique here. This is known as hyperpluralism, and this is basically pluralism gone rogue when this happens. This is the negative side of having groups competing for their interests. And what happens is these groups gain just too much strength in the system, and basically the government is just pulled in too many directions, and we have what is called gridlock that arises. It becomes slow, it becomes ineffective in its decision making. That is gridlock, when nothing can happen. So I just wanted to give you that example because we're seeing a lot of people critique pluralism in this way, that there are just too many ways for the groups to control policy. It's too hard to make everybody happy. And then we have elite democracy. And elite democracy is our third model. And basically this is saying that the elected members or representatives are the ones that make our decisions for us, and they act as trustees for the people that elect them. So when you think of it in terms of the filter, okay, this is the most filtered compared to participatory and pluralism. So in elite democracy, it recognizes that there is inequality in society and in the way the power is distributed, right? We naturally have people that are at the top of society when it comes to wealth, for example, versus at the bottom. And the idea here is that the people that have the resources and influence are the ones that dominate politics and the things that get done. So because they have the resources, they are more likely for their voices to actually be heard. This leads to a limited or filtered participation of the broader community. So you're really only hearing the voice of a select few. And the elected representatives, as I said, are the ones that are making the decisions. They're the ones that are viewed as the elite, and they're acting as trustees for the people who elect them. Now, a lot of people do consider not just government officials to be the elite, but corporations as well. The amount of money that corporations provide to the government can be seen as an elite or part of the elite model of representative democracy. And critics of this also point out that the Constitution itself was created under this type of model because the Constitution was created by 55 white guys, right? There wasn't a diverse group represented at the convention. 35 of these white men were lawyers, which is a very prominent position, very wealthy. 7 were former governors already in positions of power. 7 owned plantations, 25 owned slaves. So there was not a lot of diversity. It was a very filtered group of people that were making our new governing document. Another example of elite democracy in action would be our electoral college. And the structure of that. So yes, although the people in our system popularly elect president, right? On election day in November, you would go and vote for your candidate of choice. This year, that would be either President Donald Trump or the Democrat Joe Biden. People popularly elect the president, but the Electoral College actually serves as a check on that power because they're the ones that are actually doing the election of the president, right? So the Electoral College is serving as a check on the tyranny of the majority from the popular opinion becoming rogue. And in fact, there have been 3 times in history or 3 presidential elections where the will of the people, the popular vote, has not been respected, and the Electoral College has actually gone the opposite direction. They have elected a candidate that didn't win the popular vote. The most recent being the last election with President Trump and Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, and then President Trump won the Electoral College. So this is an example of elite democracy because it places a small group in charge of making major political decisions, even if those decisions really contradict the will of the people. So pros and cons of this. When we're thinking about pros or benefits, with this filtered participation of the elite, in theory, the more educated are the ones that are making the decisions. The people in charge in general would be more educated than the general public. They're making more informed decisions. It's more decisive even, you can think of it this way, because the group is small and limited. You don't have broad participation. It's more logistically easy to make those informed decisions. Now, the cons, on the other hand, it goes in theory, right? A lot of people criticize this, that it goes against the whole idea of democracy, because democracy was based on direct participation all the way back in Athens. So when you have just a small group making the decisions for the whole, is that actually democracy, becomes the question. Cons, unfortunately, as well, money talks. So a lot of people view, if you just have more money, you have more say in government. That can be kind of corruptive in the eyes of a lot of people. And then, does this model represent the people? When you have corporations and the elite making decisions, are the people actually represented, right? You have a small group who have a particular set of interests. Are they going to listen to the will of the people, or are they just going to advance their interests? Which would probably be, right, when you could argue, keeping power, keeping their wealth and influence, right? So is that actually representing the people like they're supposed to be doing? Okay. Now, I know that this is very broad and very abstract. So take a moment, digest this information, and come back if you need to answer the learning objectives. But remember, in this video, you should be able to identify and define the 3 types or models of representative democracy, and explain how the types and models of representative democracy are visible in major institutions, policies, events, and debates in the United States. So we talked about several examples of each model in this video. So make sure you have those notes filled out. If you need to go back and rewatch, please do. If you have questions, please make sure to ask in class or send me an email, because this concept, this topic, will pop up throughout the entire class, the entire year. So let me know if you have questions, guys. Answer your learning objectives, and I will talk to you soon. See you later.